Well, these are crazy times that we're living in, a COVID pandemic with varying restrictions and mandates, freedom, protests, and now a war in the Ukraine with potential to escalate beyond those borders. Joining us to discuss this is Rachael Thomas. She is the MP for Lethbridge, Alberta. Rachael, thanks for joining us once again today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, Rachael, all eyes are now on the Ukraine, where they're defending themselves against what most of the world views as an unprovoked military invasion by Russia. So, what is Ukraine asking Canada to do to help?
Yeah, I think really, to summarize that, I would say really Ukraine is saying, we want fewer words and more action. They want to know that Canada is standing in full solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And that means coming through with some support. And certainly we've done that to some extent, but I think that there are more things that Canada can and should do in order to stand with the Ukrainian people.
Okay, so with that said, what has Canada done so far to help, and what more can and should be done by our nation to aid Ukraine?
Yeah, for sure. So, it's certainly a number of things that have been done so far in order to assist in this situation. I think it can be broken down into two streams. So, one is to help the Ukrainian people, and then the other stream would be, what has Canada done in order to take action against Russia and, of course, Belarus, because they've shown great support for Putin as well. So, I think on the side of looking at things that have been done in order to assist Ukraine. We can talk about things like lethal and non-lethal military support that has been given. We can talk about financial support that has been given in order to aid, humanitarian efforts. A loan was given for $620 million in order to support, Ukraine's economy. In addition to that, we've definitely taken a very strong stance against Putin, against, his invasion of the Ukraine. And then the other thing that we've done, is Canada has offered to speed up the application process for visas for those wishing to flee from Ukraine and come to Canada. So those are all really good efforts in order to support the Ukrainian people. I should also mention that, as of March 3rd as well, 35% tariffs were applied to Russia and Belarus products that are coming into the nation of Canada. And so that's also a step in the right direction. When we look at other actions to counter Russia and Belarus, there are definitely sanctions that have been applied. We've prohibited Russian-owned aircraft and ships from entering Canada's airspace and waterways. We've imposed restrictions of various kinds. And we've closed our office in Russia as well. That said, I do think that there are still a few things that can be done. So, for example, giving visa-free access to come to Canada. People shouldn't have to wait for several weeks in order to be able to come. That should be granted to them, more quickly. I mean, we're talking about a war effort that is the greatest we've seen since World War II. And so Canada does have a responsibility to act and to provide assistance to these folks who are looking for safety.
Yeah, it's such a dire situation that these people are in. Absolutely. Has Canada changed its view on fossil fuels? I know some say that it would be very helpful to Ukraine and the EU if Canada were to do that and to allow for greater exports of liquid natural gas across the Atlantic to make it harder for Putin to fund his war. So incidentally, this would also be a big help to the Canadian economy. What are your thoughts on that?
hmm I appreciate the question because I think it's a really important one that needs to be asked. And it's actually also in alignment with a motion that we moved in the House of Commons on Thursday. And that motion is actually calling for attention to be given with regard to uh, the interaction that takes place between energy security and national security, because the two are very, very much tied together. So, let me explain further. Uh, Putin is able to invade Ukraine because his war machine is largely propped up by the funds received from the sale of oil and gas. If Eastern Europe doesn't have to be reliant on Russia, if they can be reliant on Canada instead for the natural gas consumption, we can actually take that money from the coffers of Russia then. In doing so, we create greater stability in the region because, of course, those Eastern European nations are no longer dependent, on the bullying, the bully in the neighborhood, I should say. And so I think we do have a great opportunity there then to develop our natural gas to make sure that we're able to get it to the Atlantic Ocean and across, and able to support Eastern Europe in this regard. In doing so, we certainly would be able to play a key role in creating greater stability within the region.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like Canada is trying to take the steps to do the right thing and do a lot. Is there anything our viewers can do to lobby our federal government to increase aid to Ukraine?
Yeah, for sure. I would encourage all Canadians, to write to the Minister of Natural Resources, to write to the Prime Minister, to write to the Deputy Prime Minister, advocate for, greater development of our industry, specifically natural gas. If we can get that pipeline in, for going from west to eastern Canada, we really can play a very key role in helping Eastern Europe, and again take away that dependency on Russia, which would allow them to exist in greater peace and stability. I think as well, other actions that Canadians can take is, the Red Cross has offered to match all donations up to $10 million, and so I certainly would encourage Canadians to participate in that also.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Rachel. Let's switch gears a little bit here now and talk about mandates, restrictions, and whatnot. So, where are we at now as a nation now that Alberta and other provinces, as well as many other nations, are beginning to lift COVID restrictions? Should the federal government be doing the same thing? What do you think about that?
Yeah, for sure. I think Canadians feel both a sense of relief and frustration. So you have provinces such as Alberta, our province, where restrictions are largely being lifted, and people are feeling a sense of relief from that. They're enjoying their newfound freedom. Um, and I think they're looking forward to the future with anticipation and expectation. And of course, that goes for businesses and individuals alike. And so that is very positive. At the same time, I think Canadians are seeing the contrast between the freedom that is taking place in Alberta right now, or being granted in Alberta, versus, what the Prime Minister's response it has been and continues to be. And so, we're watching as the Prime Minister continues to buckle down and insist on his punitive measures. For example, on January 15th, he put measures in place that prevented essential service workers from being able to leave Canada and then re-enter Canada without proof of vaccine. And of course, this has largely impacted truck drivers. It is not based in health science. It is simply punitive in nature. And I think it's sending, a message to Canadians that really this Prime Minister is out of step with the advice being given by public health experts. And it causes Canadians to ask the question, well, why? What is his motivation? Why is he failing to act prime ministerial, and to really listen to what the experts are saying and ultimately, grant freedom back to Canadians?
With that in mind, Rachel, how much of a health threat do you think there is if the US Canada border were to be opened to the unvaccinated?
Again, it's not my opinion that matters in this case. It's what the health experts are saying, and there just really is no scientific data that would suggest, the reopening of our borders would cause any significant threat. And so, based on that information, based on that science, I would say, let's open them back up. Let's get things moving. Again, I would draw people's attention to the fact that our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms does guarantee the ability to be mobile, to move between provinces, but also to move across our international border into our neighboring country should they allow us to do so. So let's get going.
Yeah, exactly. And what about the fallout from the Emergencies Act imposed by the Trudeau government? Many Canadians and indeed many other nations saw this as a significant government overreach. Should there be some kind of a better explanation from the government or some kind of consequence for taking freedoms away from Canadians, not to mention freezing bank accounts in some cases?
Again, a really great question, and certainly, I think you're asking a number of the questions that Canadians are also asking. So when it comes to the Emergencies Act, really what we have to wonder is, was the threshold met in terms of whether or not it was reasonable or right for the Prime Minister to enact the Emergencies Act? Ultimately, the threshold is that the Prime Minister should have no other tool at his disposal or current law at his reach that would help deal with, the crisis at hand. Well, in this case, the Emergencies Act was invoked after we saw the border crossing in Windsor cleared, after we saw the border crossing in Manitoba cleared, after we saw the border crossing at Coutts in Alberta cleared, after we saw the border crossing in Surrey cleared. So all four of these borders were able to be cleared out, and the protests were resolved peacefully without the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So for the Prime Minister then to claim that he needed the Emergencies Act in order to bring, order back to Ottawa is just absolute ludicrous. It is incredibly disingenuous, in my opinion, because ultimately, at the end of the day, we see that the tools that the Prime Minister needed, or that the police needed in order to act, they already existed. The Emergencies Act was simply an overreach of power. It was a flex that the Prime Minister got to engage in order to try to salvage his own image. It was wrong. It was very, very wrong, I believe. Further to that, what we saw is on Monday, the Emergencies Act was passed in the House of Commons because the Liberals and the NDP teamed up on that. But then by Wednesday, the Prime Minister was making an announcement that he was actually going to be revoking the Emergencies Act. It was no longer in effect. What changed from Monday to Wednesday? Well, I can tell you this. Nothing in the downtown core of Ottawa changed within that 48-hour period of time. The only thing that changed was public opinion. And so I applaud Canadians for standing up and for speaking out, for making their voices heard, because ultimately, I do believe that they applied enough pressure that the Prime Minister saw he was going to be made a fool of if he continued down that road. Again, I would draw people's attention to the fact that nothing changed in those 48 hours, which again should tell us that Emergencies Act really wasn't needed. The only emergency there was one that Trudeau created for himself. He needed to save his image.
Wow, unprecedented times, absolutely. These are. Rachael, let's switch gears once again. Your own party is going through some transition currently. Any thoughts on the CPC leadership race? Some see it as boiling down to a race between true blue conservatives like Pierre Poilievre and red Tories like maybe perhaps Jean Charest or Peter MacKay. What's happening there?
Sure. I guess I would maybe lead out by saying this, and that is my opinion on the matter is this. I think for a long time we've talked about, the reform conservative, the social conservative, the red Tory, the blue Tory, etc. We have these terms that we like to use to describe variations within conservatism. My hope is that in this race we actually abandon that practice. A conservative is a conservative is a conservative. And one of the things that we pride ourselves in as conservatives is the ability to span the right side of the political spectrum and hold, a variety of viewpoints within that framework. So really, I'm looking for those who are, leadership hopefuls to be able to clearly define the essential principles of conservatism versus the peripherals. And they're going to have to really do some soul searching and I think through what those critical items are in terms of our principles as a party. And then they're going to need a plan that they put in place in terms of how to adhere to those principles. Not only that, but also how do you then communicate those things to the public in a way where, we can attract the swing voter in order to, of course, win their vote in the next election. So I really think it comes down to a few things, obviously, a vision that captivates Canadians. It comes down to, being able to unify this country, East, West, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, French, English. We really need someone who will be able to bring unity. We need to take a stand for freedom. And again, very clearly define what we mean by that. We need to stand for a strong economy and for its rebuilding effort going forward. And we need to also have a concrete plan in place in terms of our position on the world stage and how we're going to advance Canada within that global context.
All right. Well, it looks like we are about out of time here, but thanks so much for being with us today, Rachel. Really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you.